1930s. It's a woodland fabric park with spaces designed by landscape architects in the 1930s, 1933. And this is what it's like. Now, this is literally 10 minutes from the Rijksmuseum in the center of Amsterdam. It's much more spatially complex. It's much more taxonomically complex. It's rich in wildlife, etc. It's not Victoria Park. And it offers these sorts of experiences. It's a mixture of nature and culture to create places which are special and meaningful. So, it's mostly based on native woodland, but native woodland is not a universal panacea. And one of the real challenges in cities is, one of the big challenges in cities is a huge amount of the green space is mown grass, like Victoria Park. And that is the elephant in the room for nature conservation in cities. It's not gardens, because gardens are already very, very rich. So, in terms of biodiversity, especially invertebrate biodiversity. The challenge is the mown grass, the green desert in cities. And of course, if you're trying to make a jump from green desert to woodland, that's going to be much more challenging. There'll be places where you can do that. But in many cases, the sort of wood pasture or orchard landscape is much more palatable. And you could very quickly retrofit a lot of green space with orchard type, what would become cultural wood pasture very, very readily without anyone saying boo, because it doesn't actually interfere with a lot of the functions of green space. Clearly you need areas to fly kites and big gatherings, but a lot of landscapes, that green space is just there. That green sward is just there because local authorities are tooled up to manage it as grass. They're culturally wired to do this, but we could have something like this. And we know that biodiversity-wise, these sorts of wood pasture, orchard, open landscapes are by far the richest landscapes for nature conservation in temperate regions. And indeed, this is what the landscape was originally like post the Ice Age because of oryx, etc., and large mega herbivores, bison and moose, all the things we killed out post the Ice Age were making these sorts of landscapes. So this is the landscape that of the British Isles. That's this, if you want a natural thing post the Ice Age, this is what it really was. And I was at Kew in the autumn, and I've only seen a green woodpecker close up 3 times in my life. And the previous 2 times were near Mooka Meadows, where you have like a wood pasture, fragments of rather sort of tortured oak in meadows. And the 3rd time was at Kew Gardens in the middle of London. There's the green woodpecker in basically a landscape of non-native trees in grass, and it was actually in the rose garden I took the picture. And so, it's a sort of interesting parallel. So, the most species don't care what the trees are, it's actually the physical structures which are important. I don't know if you know about this. This is the Great Dixter. I don't know if you know even about Great Dixter. It depends how interested you are in gardens as opposed to nature conservation in rural or wild landscapes. But Great Dixter got some money from the Heritage Lottery to actually have its landscapes. And Great Dixter is a garden, and it's a big estate with ancient woodlands and coppice woodlands and ancient meadows and all this sort of stuff. Anyway, they published this audit, and one of the really fascinating things is the most rich part of the landscape that the ecological surveyors looked at, it wasn't the ancient woodlands, it wasn't the ancient meadows, it was the garden. So the most cultural bit was the richest in species, in native species. So, and yet, if you talk to the people at Dixter, they had enormous problems with the surveying teams initially when they came, because they didn't want to look at the garden because they had this nature conservation idea that, oh, if it's a really cultural place and it's full of alien plants, it doesn't support any life. But we've known this is not the case for 30 years now. And yet nature conservation still clings to this notion of this sort of this is somehow not really proper nature conservation because it's taking place in this cultural environment. And this seems to me to be a terrible lost opportunity to bridge nature conservation ever more into the cultural realm where all the political power lives. So I think this is something we need to think about. So if you look at these designed urban landscapes from gardens and everything else, and because we see them very strongly through the lens of our culture. But if you strip this away, what are these landscapes in ecological terms, and how do they compare with natural and semi-natural landscapes? So there's, Jennifer Owen, started looking at what lived in her garden in Leicester, approximately 35 years ago. And so we've been doing this for a long, long time. But, so this is some work which was done in Sheffield at the university. They've called the BUGS project, the Biodiversity in Urban Gardens. And one of the interesting things is this produced some really fascinating data, really shocking data. I mean, really sort of, really worldview changing data. But what you find is that, a lot of people have already, if you talk to people in local authority, nature conservation officers, they either don't know about this or they've long since forgotten about it. And that's really, really interesting about this capacity to hold a view and then not be able to actually respond to the literature because the literature holds a view contrary to yours. That's not my view of the world as a scientist. The way I see the world is I hold things as true until it's obvious they're not true, and then I move on. And this hasn't really happened. It's a problem. We haven't actually sort of moved forward. And this stuff was done in 2003, and a lot of it's been buried and forgotten about, unfortunately. I'm almost there, by the way, Nabil. So if you're wondering when I'm going to stop, it's about another 10 minutes or so. It's about an hour. So if you look at urban gardens, again, from this same series of papers, if you look at the contribution these landscapes make to urban areas, you can see that gardens are very significant contributors in the Sheffield area. So, you've got 2,600 hectares of woodland, and you've got five, almost double that of gardens and allotments, etc. So these cultural landscapes are really, really very important indeed. And perhaps I'm speaking to the converted. I probably am. I hope I am anyway. And but one of the characteristics of these areas is they're full of aliens, particularly aliens from Europe and Asia. That's potentially quite challenging for some people. But it's not necessarily challenging to the invertebrates, that many of the invertebrate species that actually live in these sites. When you ask the question, what are gardens ecologically? One of the really interesting things about gardens is because they are the product of human beings interacting and making decisions using human agency, they don't behave like natural ecosystems. So if you look at this graph here, which is looking at the number of species, the cumulative number of species in different habitat types, native habitat types, with the exception of gardens and derelict land. If you look at the crosses, the line with the crosses, that's limestone grassland. The limestone grassland, pretty much the richest sort of community in terms of species per unit area in the UK biota. But then if you look at gardens, and what happens with natural habitats, the curve levels off because there's only so many species in a biota. And sooner or later, if you take enough samples, you run out of any new species. And so the curve levels. And this happens in all natural ecosystems. But one of the curious things about gardens is they're extraordinarily diverse on scale. So every garden's a bit different, and most gardens are almost completely different. What's in my garden is not present in the garden on either side, and vice versa. And so what happens with gardens is the curve doesn't level. The curve just keeps going up. And so in terms of plant complements, the plant biodiversity in gardens is hugely greater than even in the richest the richest natural habitats. And this is just a phenomenon. It's just how it is. And it's because of us, because we make decisions. We have agency. And if you look at the total number of species in 121 meter quadrats in Sheffield, 438 species in gardens compared, which is, more than double the next richest. So this is really, really interesting. And so if you want to increase nature conservation in gardens, the way you do it is you encourage more people to garden more ambitiously, to have more complex spatial gardens, to have more species, etc. That's really the way you do it. You don't encourage them to have nettles because there's no utility in that, because nettles are very common. Hence the title of Ken Thompson's book, No Nettles Required. There's no marginal utility in having nettles in a garden. There may be marginal utility in having tussocky grasses, but not nettles. So this is my garden in inner city Sheffield and Walkley, and I have 700 plant species in that 2050 meter garden, which is fabulously rich compared to semi-natural landscapes. Some of them are native, mostly they are not. There's been a lot of work done in urban areas to trying to nail down where the biodiversity is in the last decade. This was a big study done, probably the biggest study in the world, on exactly where are pollinators in urban areas. What are the hotspots? And this is a paper that was published in, when was it? About 2017, I think. Anyway, I just want to show you some of the data just as we come to the end of all of this stuff. What's on the next one? Yeah, let's look at this. Let's look at this one. Okay, so there's a massive data, obviously. Let me just show you this. Okay, so what they looked at, let's just use bees as an example. So this is bee abundance. That's the number of bees that were sampled in these different landscape types. And the different colored bars are different cities. And you can see they actually went down the equivalent of Oxford Street with a swipe net. They looked at everywhere. They looked at pavement, they looked at hard surfaces, they looked at these other landscapes. But in terms of bee abundance and in terms of in general for pollinators, the richest landscapes in terms of bee abundance, the best landscapes for bee abundance were allotments, vegetable gardens, and then secondly gardens. And nature reserves were not as good, and parks were similar to nature reserves, and etc., etc. And when you look at bee richness, that's the number of species. Again, allotments were still the best, and that's because bee abundance is often driven very significantly by the resources which are available, the pollen and the nectar, the continuity of supply, the sugar concentration, because bees make choices. Bees have emotional states. They're not just little machines, they actually make choices. And so they go with the resources, all things being equal. And so this is actually really extraordinary. The most cultural landscapes for bees were actually the richest in terms of species. So it really does make you think about, some of these sorts of issues. And there's a whole range of literature on this sort of stuff, which is really, it's sort of pulling the rug away from the idea, that gardens full of non-native species are fundamentally poor for the conservation of native animals. The real exception to all of this is the larvae of, for example, the butterfly Lepidoptera, but not the moth Lepidoptera, and plant-feeding herbivorous insects. These are the ones which are most hardwired into chemical signals of species they might have co-evolved with. But of course, what you have to remember is that the fauna of the Palearctic, that's the ecological unit from the west coast of Ireland to Vladivostok, those things have been knocking around together for millions of years through changed ecological times. And it's a pretty generalist fauna in the main compared, say, the southern hemisphere. So, you know, you shouldn't be surprised if these relationships are not very fixed, you know, and this is the sort of pattern that's coming out of all of this sort of stuff. Uh, you can read this in your own time if you want. So, you know, when you see landscapes like this is a sort of, so perhaps in our urban places, this is an Italian Renaissance square. And, you know, here with the designed landscape, it's an installation. It's only there for 3 weeks. But if you were, it's a real paradox, as you've got an Italian Renaissance square, which is utterly sterile in terms of biodiversity, a few pigeons, and here a vegetation has been put in place amongst the pavement cafes, which has got the spatial structure and everything to be potentially rather good for nature conservation. But it's only an installation. So, you know, these sorts of things. So what the point I'm trying to get at here is very often it's about spatial structure, it's about complexity, it's about taxonomic complexity. This is what we should be aiming at in cities. We shouldn't get too hooked up in many cases on whether those species are native or non-native. You have to ask yourself, would it be better or worse to have a greater area of species which were a mixture of natives and non-natives, or purely a smaller area that was natives only? Because that's the political sell you might actually have, especially in Britain, which is such a strong gardening culture. So the real issue, this is in Melbourne in Australia, is the native is token. So these eucalypts are native, but the main problem in this landscape is that there isn't enough native vegetation, you know. So this is native vegetation as tokenism, you know. In actual fact, if we're interested in increasing richness, we have to say we need more trees, rather than simply have these small icons, which are ecologically fairly meaningless. So what are landscape architects and nature conservation people to make of all of this? I think the first thing is that within the Northwestern European biota, the native versus non-native thing in urban areas is largely a red herring, from an invertebrate conservation perspective. The critical difference between native and non-native plants is not about one being good for nature and the other bad. Rather, it's about human-generated notions about character. So native species are extremely important for character. And also they have the capacity to regenerate reliably in many landscapes, and therefore they are capable of self-sustaining themselves. And because they are potentially climatically and sometimes ecologically most fit, although of course climate change pulls the rug away increasingly out from some of those things, you know, they can self-sustain. And the problem with non-native species is the ones that can self-sustain, we call them invasive weeds, and so we don't allow them to self-sustain. And you know, and obviously there are very good reasons for that, because you don't want to lose character. But it's a real catch-22, isn't it? So native species are really important, but it's very much about character and capacity to reproduce in many cases. And non-native species just do this less well. And if they do that, as I say, it's seen as invasion. So it's problematic for us. One of the interesting things is that if you're worried about non-native species, and you know, and I am to a degree, but at the same time, I also know that the evidence suggests, bit by bit, it's beginning to accrue, is that non-natives, you know, eventually become native. Systems eventually fix themselves. Fauna looks as if it adapts. If you look at California, the entire Californian butterfly fauna has jumped ship from Californian apiaceae to Southern European Mediterranean apiaceae. The show goes on because as native apiaceae have become rarer and rarer, the butterflies have jumped to Southern European apiaceae. They've got the same chemical signals or similar chemical signals. So, you know, so we shouldn't get too down about this stuff. And even, you know, plants which are terrible, potentially terrible environmental weeds like Rhododendron ponticum. You know, Ian Rotherham's been doing some work on this, and the Rhododendron ponticum is accruing more and more species as time goes on, since they did the last study in the 1990s. So organisms adapt. So perhaps the origin of the species is not the fundamental issue for nature conservation and biodiversity in urban areas. This is just about the final paper. So this is a paper in Journal of Applied Ecology, and what they did in this study is they looked at actually how native insects basically jump ship to colonize exotic trees that they previously had no evolutionary experience of. And what they found is that the more common that the non-native species were, and the larger areas that so the more of them that there were, the faster native insects acclimated to be able to operate and to feed on non-native trees. So this is a really interesting, this is like a world review of this sort of stuff. So it's an interesting thought, but you know, it's almost inevitable, you know, that native fauna will eventually adapt to non-native species because they're simply an unused resource. And this is what will happen. So to finish the final page. So what's the fundamental for landscape architects in terms of what we should do in terms of our contribution to biodiversity? So to try and avoid things like, you know, the Boots Island master plan, I think we have to fundamentally, you know, rethink our relationship with vegetation in cities. So we need to maximize the area of vegetation for cities, and we need to become passionate advocates for doing that. You know, not see ourselves as sort of architects who it's all about the built. Clearly, this is very difficult to do because land has value, you know, and so you really have to ask ourselves, you know, are our planning systems actually, you know, are we asking enough questions in our planning system in terms of what is acceptable, you know, what is the minimum? In Germany, they have planning laws which are all about known as the balancing acts. And basically what they say is, if you take an area of land to build a new bus garage, you have to find that equivalent area of land somewhere else on the top of the building or something. And we need perhaps to increasingly move to these sorts of approaches. To maximize the volume of leafage, the more area of foliage you have, the more life. Area of foliage is extremely important in terms of biodiversity. We need to maximize spatial complexity. And of course, so, you know, Victoria Park with its mown grass and its tall, high canopy, by its very nature, there's a crisis throughout the urban world, and it is the absence of that intermediate canopy layers beneath the canopy and between the ground. In all parts of the world, all the research shows that it's the absence of that in many urban areas which impoverishes, particularly in terms of insectivorous birds, which are the dominant species, bird species in those layers. You put those layers back, you get those species back. But you have to find ways to do that which are politically and culturally acceptable. To prioritize the use of native species that are seed limited due to poor distribution capacity. So, you know, they are the native species which should be the best priority, the top priority, because, you know, they cannot get there of their own volition, because things like Primulaveris, it's not a really rare species, but because the seed's heavy, its distribution is extremely slow. And they are the things we should be focusing on as landscape architects, making sure we're providing a leg up to those sorts of species to try to put back some of the connectivity, the potential or the functional connectivity, which is being lost through urbanization and without thinking about things. Putting back oxeye daisies, who cares? It's an irrelevance. It's really about the species which cannot do it themselves. Oxeye daisies have much better seed distribution capacity. We need to maximize taxonomic complexity. We need to maximize typological complexity. What that means is many different habitat types together in unit areas to maximize the opportunity, the chance of native animals finding somewhere to live. And we need to integrate these principles into every project, but be nuanced about making this meaningful for ordinary people. So what it looks like really matters. It really matters. It's not shallow. It's not superficial. That's where those people are. It's what's meaningful to them. So we have to think about those sorts of things. And so finally, landscape architects have to come to value these things and argue for them. We need to challenge the urban design management development cultures that want to do the opposite of this. You know, we need to change how we resource landscapes from being design heavy to being care heavy. The elephant in the room in terms of nature conservation in cities is actually that we do not have the management capacity to do the things that would greatly improve nature conservation capacity. That's the problem, because we've spent all the resources at the design end, and then we have no resources. And that's very politically difficult. It's exactly the same situation as you have in the National Health Service in terms of medicine versus social care. It's a direct parallel. We all know it's the big issue, but we cannot crack it because of the vested interests in that issue. And I think, last point, and we have to start utilizing the shaming culture, perhaps. Perhaps we have to say it's just not right. You know, we need to do better than this. Good. Okay, so that's me, I think. So thank you very much. I hope that's being a little bit provocative, and that you might want to ask some questions.
Thanks, James. We have had some questions in the chat, so I'll read some out for you if you want to answer them.
I'll do my best.
Right. Some of these questions may have been covered in your presentation, but you can always summarize.
Sure.
Question 1, what are the conflicts between the design landscape and rewilding?
What are the conflicts? Well, I guess one of the biggest conflicts is that the design landscape is very much still based in the main on the idea that you design something, you implement it on the ground, and you then sort of maintain to keep it in a fixed state. So it's a little bit like, you know, we tend to still see landscape as, and especially from clients and people commissioning work, whether it's government or individuals commission, we see it as a product like buying a new car. We don't see it as a process in which we aren't certain what it's going to become in the future. We're rather scared of that. And rewilding is really all about tossing a pebble into a pond and seeing where the ripples go and seeing what actually happens. So that's a very different approach to actually, you know, so I think in terms of landscape, you know, landscape architects, you know, many are interested in rewilding, but they're thinking, how do I sell that to a client who is obsessed with the idea of, I want to know exactly what this is going to look like because I've bought this product like a new Maserati. And in China, that's a huge problem, you know, and I fight against that all the time. It's really, really difficult, but it's the change that we need to have to actually make, you know, it's a societal change of how we value things. And clearly it's something which is shaped by capitalism, about ownership and you know, and all these sorts of things, you know, it's deeply rooted, these sorts of ideas in people. So that's my attempt at that one.
Thank you. Question 2. I've been told that double-flowered trees are no good for pollinators. Is this true, and why?
It's largely true because in most cases, because the reproductive double-flowered trees, in most cases, the extra row of petals, they are the sort of the reproductive tackle, if you like, has been reorganized as another set of petals. So they don't normally produce any pollen and nectar. But it's important not to get, you know, too paranoid about that. You know, I mean, obviously it's much better to have species which provide those resources, but, you know, hey, you know, perhaps, you know, Prunus kanzan, it's that ridiculous frilly pink cherry tree, you know, as long as we don't completely fill our cities up with it, what does it matter if we have a few of those? You know, there's still a leaf surface area for parasitoids and predators and leaf-sucking insects to live on, you know, and if it actually engages people with vegetation who might not be otherwise interested in vegetation, you know, I think that's a sacrifice worth having, as long as it's not everywhere, like London Plain in London.
Thank you. And what is the best tree species for biodiversity?
Well, that's an interesting question, because if you look at the work of Southwood, was the god of animal ecology, you know, in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, he published this famous paper, which was about how many invertebrates were associated with trees. I'm sorry, the answer is a little bit longer than just a name. And when you look at the paper, there's a famous table in it which ranks native and non-native trees, mostly native trees, but there's a few non-native trees at the bottom. And the best trees are generally oaks. So there were about 423 species associated with oaks. But of course, anyone who reads that paper or doesn't read that paper, because this is the paper which launched the idea that natives were profoundly good and non-natives were profoundly bad, because the non-natives are mostly species at the bottom of the list, so not the very bottom. The Taxus baccata is at the bottom, and that's a native species. But there's a lot of problems with that paper, that everyone assumed that what he did is he pumped up insecticides into trees and they captured the insects which rained down, the dead insects, and then identified. They didn't do that at all. What they did is, it was a literature review. So they looked at oak and they went through and they looked at how many insects were named in papers written by invertebrate ecologists on oaks. Well, of course, most of the papers that were looked at were more about native trees than non-native trees. So there was a terrible skewing in the data from the offset. So it's a terribly misleading paper, but I think it's a fair cut that oaks are very rich in invertebrates. But the question is whether Quercus pubescens, which is a European oak, which is just found on the other side of the channel, but not found in the UK, it never got back after Ice Age, whether that is any worse than Quercus robur and Quercus pedunculata. Okay, sorry, Quercus petrea. That's the big issue. So oaks are very good. Birch are very good. Generally speaking, the native species are the best, but there are some natives which are rather poor, and there are some exotics which are very good. So it's not absolutely, it's not very black and white. And so, you know, be careful how you interpret this. The critical thing with trees is it's very age dependent. So if you look at, so young trees of any species support tiny fragments of the life they support when they're old and decaying. So what we really want is, as trees become older, the bark typically becomes more furrowed, they support more invertebrates associated with the bark, you know, they get more decomposition, etc. It's these sorts of things which are probably as important, almost in some cases, as the taxa themselves.
Thank you. And the next question, with biodiversity net gain being a new requirement coming into England planning system, ecologists and landscape architects will need to work even more closely together on developments. How can these disciplines talk to each other more before the two potentially suggest two different sites?
Well, landscape architects have worked on many projects. Landscape architects already work with ecologists, particularly on big projects, you know, and have done for a long time. Northwestern Europe, as I said at the beginning, the integration of landscape architects and ecology is actually quite finely developed, although of course it varies between individual practices, etc. I guess what the new requirements will do is that they will make people who are less interested in doing that, it will make them more interested in doing so. So there will be a positive shift. But I think it's very important we don't go on a tick box exercise. You know, I mean, there's a project taking place at Elephant and Castle at the moment in the centre of London. Very good landscape architect doing that. You know, young, completely engaged in all these ideas, you know, about biodiversity. But, you know, he's getting a really hard time because the local conservation officer wanted all to be native species. You know, and in actual fact has got no sense of actually what might be success for the multi-ethnic society that's around this place, nor for the fact we have this thing called climate change, with London actually whizzing off to become Bordeaux, then Barcelona. And so, you know, that it's important we don't then just have landscape architects with a tick box and actually, so this, I hope this doesn't have a negative effect of actually simply saying, oh, here's a list, yeah, we'll just use that, whatever type thing. I think it's really important these things are used to make people think more deeply about what they do and not simply go for a tick box approach.
Thank you. We'll just ask a few more questions that have come in. Which particular species should be reintroduced in the Rivlin Valley?
Oh, well, I think I'd like to, I'm not saying they're not there. I'm just, there's a, you know, I haven't done an exhaustive survey, but when I walk there in spring, I mean, there's very few Primula vulgaris, for example. There's very small amounts of wood anemones, just standard classic woodland understory species. There's very few populations of bluebells are remarkably sparse, and it's the same in the Porter Valley too. I think you've got to remember these valleys were very heavily worked as industrial landscapes for a very long time, probably very heavily grazed for a very long time. And a lot of these species were simply probably eliminated by land use pressure. But, you know, if we wait for them to come back, you know, given that a primula takes, to move a meter takes 3 years and to move 100 meters, you know, you get the idea. It takes a long time. So this just actually having a more hands-on approach to this and not actually just waiting for natural processes to deliver, kickstart things and empower people, to make people interested. You know, this is what we need to do. In the Ponderosa in Sheffield, there were none of these species whatsoever. You know, it would be a good thing for us to go out there. Even if you just plant 10 plants, it might act as a bridgehead. And once these things are there, they spread often very vigorously by self-seeding, and they form these concentric rings and gradually move out. So after 50 years, you would have tens of thousands.
Thank you. And just referring to table 2 in your presentation, you can remember which table 2 was. A question, is that all species or just native species in the gardens?
It's all species. Is this the one, you'll have to, because I don't know which table 2 is. Is that the one where you had the 438 species?
Nikki, this was your question. Do you want to come in if you're still there? Oh, she said yes.
Yeah, that's all species. You know, the ecologists didn't distinguish between them, and most of the native species would have been, and the majority of them would have, most of the native contribution would have mostly been ruderal weeds and plants and lawns. They would have been things like bellis, it would have been native grasses, etc. But the great bulk, in gardens in Britain in general, the natives are normally less than 30% of the taxa, and non-natives are normally 70% plus in the average garden.
Thank you. How do you guard against unseen dangers of severe damage, or Dutch elm, flatworms in Ireland, etc.?
How do we guard against what severe damage of?
How do you unseen dangers of severe damage? So they gave the examples of Dutch elm and flatworms in Ireland.
Well, I mean, obviously, look, the way things have moved now is, I mean, now we've left the European Union. You know, we now have an extraordinary sort of set of barriers to anything coming in. We are literally an island now. So it's become very difficult for any material to come in from outside. So in one sense, the lid's being closed. And I mean, to the point which is serious concern to people like me, because, you know, how do you get genetic material of Southern European populations of perhaps native oaks, which you might need by 2060 for climate change amelioration? How do you get those into the country even now? You know, there's a real problem there. The simple answer is that in some cases, I mean, you can keep some things out, but you know, really, it's very difficult to remove all of the risk. I think the thing to understand about Dutch elm disease, I mean, obviously that came in from logs from North America. That's where the big event catastrophe happened. But the thing to understand is Dutch elm disease had occurred for millennia throughout the history of Europe. And if you look at the records, Dutch elm disease was just a regular explosion every few hundred years and had been for thousands and thousands of years. So some of these things you just have to probably accept. It's just about flux and ecosystems, and with the best will in the world, it's really, really difficult. It's like, it's obviously, it's like, ash decline. I mean, ash decline, did it come in on nursery stock from Denmark? Did it blow across the North Sea? Some of these things are really just part of the perturbations you get in ecosystems, however unfortunate and however harmful. You just get these things in ecosystems every now and again.
Thank you. Can I just ask participants no more questions, because we're going to run severely late. So I'm just going to ask 3 more and then questions after that. Thank you. So James, can you please suggest a good resource for overview of native species that have limited seed distribution?
I don't think there is a one, to be honest. Probably one of the best measures is simply seed weight. So because big heavy seeded species, unless they have a vector which actually moves them, are typically going to be pretty bad at getting around. So anything that's got a seed, we look at, typically seeds are categorized in terms of numbers of seed per gram in the literature. So primulas, for example, Primula vulgaris, it's got about 1,000 seeds per gram. So that's once your seed gets bigger than that, if it doesn't have a vector, it tends to be rather slow at being moved around. So oaks have things like jays, obviously, which are really important for moving those. What you could do is, if you looked in, I think the resource which is readily available, if you looked at the biological atlas of the British Isles, the flora of the British Isles, the atlas, it's online. It gives some of that information. It might give information on seed weight in there. You could try that. But species which are poorly distributed, they're very common in woodlands, as woodland understory species. And they are also pretty common in species-rich grassland, limestone grasslands, etc. They are the 2 ecosystems, and most of the plants that are in the seed that's moving around the place, they are mostly what we call ruderals, short-lived species. They now dominate the seed rain, which is moving around in urban places, and this is why, as soon as you disturb an area, you get a lot of fat hen and sort of an weedy annual species, that they just dominate the seed rain, and these other species are just absent from the seed rain pretty much in urban areas. They're just not there. So if they're not already on a site, they're never going to appear. It's just not going to happen.
Thank you. Just 2 more questions now.
Yeah.
What weight are you giving to soil ecology in your design thinking?
Sorry, there's a bit of things happening at home here. I'm just trying to a bit of echoing. Problem. So just ask the question again.
What weight are you giving to soil ecology in your design thinking?
Well, quite a bit actually, but probably look, if you're engineering sort of native plant communities in urban areas, I don't know where this question's coming from, so I don't know what the asker's got in there, what they're thinking. But so I'm making some guesses of what they're thinking. But the biggest challenge is not, sort of the microbial mass. It's not the mycorrhizal situation, because they're things you simply cannot control. They're just background, and we just don't know how to actually, we just can't really do much about that. The main issue is productivity of the materials. So if you're trying to manufacture native ecosystems and make them stable, the critical thing in most cases is using soils which are unproductive. So that normally means low nutrient levels, sometimes low clay and organic matter. And they are the soils really which give you the best chance, with the exception of wetland plants of wet habitats, to engineer sort of stable communities. And then in time, some of the biological components, the microbial components, the soil macrofauna, they will colonize in time. But but that is the critical issue. I mean, there are huge numbers of people, for example, in the UK sowing meadows on most infrastructure projects. But unless that material is sown onto subsoil or crushed building or other very infertile materials, if you sow on topsoil, which is rich in these micro and macro fauna elements, it just collapses due to dominance, the emergence of dominance in the most vigorous species. So the main issue for me, the Olympic Park grasslands are still there because those grasslands are mostly sand. If we'd used topsoil, they would have gone long ago, and they would just be rank grass with no forbs in them whatsoever now. So that would be my response.
Thank you.
Horses for courses, it depends on the plant communities you want to engineer. But productivity is the single biggest issue, as it is in the agricultural landscape. The reason agricultural landscapes are so species poor in terms of plants is simply because of collateral nutrient contamination from fertilizing fields. That is why biodiversity is collapsing on road verges. It's not because of an absence of microfauna or macrofauna. It's not about the soil constituents, it's about competition.
Thank you. And last question. You have mentioned that farming is a huge problem, but you have not specified what type of farming is the problem.
Well, it's all a problem, basically. So, pretty much. Look, it's a problem because, it's a bit of a long question. So it's a problem in the uplands because those uplands are incredibly species poor. They support a tiny range of organisms. They are hugely problematic in terms of storm water flooding out of upland areas into catchments lower down. So they are, the uplands are essentially, they are essentially biological deserts, pretty much. And then if you look at lowland farming, if you look at arable farming, the use of herbicides is so sophisticated now that there are no plants other than the crop there, and therefore there are none of the weeds which many birds rely on. Their chicks need a high protein diet at the beginning. Most of those invertebrates live on the weeds that used to live in arable fields. They are now gone. And so there are very few invertebrates. So there is starvation of species which depend on those invertebrate larvae for their food. So the curve is like this. We are literally crashing into the ground because of the collapse of invertebrates in rural landscapes. And then you have all the nutrient addition. You have things like silage, monocultures of grass, which are cut 2 or 3 times a year instead of hay meadows. The birds living in those are simply macerated by the cutting equipment. They are monocultures. They offer no ecosystem services in terms of nectar and pollen. Should I go on?
No, that's fine. Thank you. That I think that answered the question as much as possible. That's all we have time for question-wise.
Yeah, sorry for being so depressing. But I mean, really, we are up shit creek.
Okay, I can just see that Jerry actually has his hand up. Is that you wanting to? Yeah, that's a historical hand. Okay, no problem then. Well, I will finish by saying thank you very much to James. It's been really interesting and made lots of people think. So a massive from us at Sheffield Wildlife and Wildlife Trust. Thank you to all of our participants that joined us this evening. We hope you enjoyed it. And once again, thank you for all your kind donations. Charity, it really does make a difference to our work. So thank you. And I put in a link in the chat to our next event as part of our Action for Insects. So please come along to that. Everyone is really welcome. And thank you again to James and to Nabil at the start. And I will say good night, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Good. Well, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Bye-bye.
Bye all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.